Welcome to the FARcast here at Chadron State College. I'm Daniel Binkard with my co-host Alex Helmbrecht, and we're here with Elizabeth Kraatz, who is an assistant professor in psychological sciences. Elizabeth, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, good to have you on. So let's get right into our questions. How long have you been at CSC, and what classes are you currently teaching?
So I started here last July, so this is my second year teaching, with my first semester being last fall. And I am currently teaching educational psychology, introduction to psychology, social psychology, and developmental psychology.
Are those classes online, or
they're all in person.
They're face-to-face?
Mm-hmm, they're all face-to-face.
Okay.
Yep, so I'm teaching 5, because I have 2 sections of intro psych. So it's 4 preps, 5 classes.
That sounds like a busy year.
It is extremely busy.
Welcome to teaching, right?
I'm not sure I have time to think, but...
So you said so this is the beginning of your second year.
Yes.
So with that first year, was there maybe some growing pains? I'm assuming maybe you were a teaching assistant before or something like that. But
to some degree. So I taught, I was really fortunate to be able to teach for 4 years at Ohio State, both as a teaching associate, a TA, and as an adjunct. But Ohio State, since we were in, my PhD's in educational psychology, so, they assume we know how to teach. And so they really kind of say, this is the book that we use, go to town. I was an independent instructor, functioning in very much the same capacity that I do here for 4 years. I just technically didn't have the title. But here I get to teach more classes. So it was the first time I taught social psych. It was the first time I taught intro psych. And a lot of the content between developmental and ed psych overlaps, but it was my first time teaching an official developmental psych class. So, coming up with new preps is always hard. But,
sure.
But as far as the job duties, those were pretty comparable.
Well, and I think we've heard from a lot of our faculty, especially the ones who've been so generous to appear on this, that Chadron State really is a teaching institution. Mm-hmm. So it's you're really out there in front of the students. You're not hiding in an office or doing anything like that.
I'm in front of them every day
That's great.
Multiple hours, which is what I wanted.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when I was looking for jobs. That's what I wanted, was to be working with the undergrads, with them in person, not hiding in an office.
Yeah, exactly. So. Leave that to me and Daniel. We can do that for everyone else.
Yep.
So you mentioned Ohio State. Tell us a little bit about your educational background.
So I actually, I tell my students it's okay if they don't know what they want to do yet, because I think I had 6 majors. Before I graduated with my undergrad. So I transferred twice, and I think I had 6 different majors. But I ended at Ohio State with a degree in middle childhood math and science education. And then I taught 8th grade for a little while. And I didn't like 8th graders when I was an 8th grader. They don't get better when you're an adult. So I was like, maybe the middle school thing is not so much my cup of tea. And so then I got my master's in early childhood education. And then I ended up getting my PhD. I got my master's from Delta State University in Mississippi, and then I went back to Ohio State for my PhD in educational psychology.
I'm curious, what were the 6 majors?
Oh, so I started out as a pre-vet equine double major. And then, so that's 2. And then I was a musical theater major for like a hot minute. And then I was a straight theater major for a little while. And then I was a wildlife science major. And then I went to education.
So we need to find a profession that encompasses all of those.
Right,
so maybe you could run a big game preserve where you give tours and you sing.
In a Shakespearean style and musical.
You speak in
and
blank,
we sing,
You speak in blank verse.
Yeah. No, well, I always tell my students I couldn't pick what I wanted to learn because I like to learn everything. And so eventually I just decided to study learning, and I just gave up on picking a thing, and I just said, well, fine, I'll just learn about learning, and we'll call it good.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That works. So where did you grow up? And obviously there may have been a shift around there, but was there a point, did you always know, was psychology always in the background, or how did that evolve?
It wasn't. So I grew up in Wilmington, Ohio, which is a relatively small town for Ohio, not by Nebraska standards, but and psychology was not even on my radar. It was not something that was offered at my high school, so it wasn't something I had any kind of interaction with. And even into my PhD program, I was interested in the education part of educational psychology. And so it wasn't until sort of into the program that I started branching out and realizing how much overlap there was with things like social and developmental psych, and really kind of getting interested in the areas where those things overlap with the educational world and influence what happens in school and things like that. And so it's really been in the last 4 or 5 years that I've kind of made the shift into psychology from kind of being a pure education world person, which is very different because I'm not I see the education faculty now and again in meetings and stuff, but I'm not in that world anymore. So it's been very different to be here because Ed Psych at Ohio State is its own entity. And so, you're still surrounded by education people all day.
Oh, okay. So how did you wind up here? I mean, Ohio to Nebraska. I don't figure that it's too far, but were you looking for a place where you could teach a lot, or?
Yeah. So when I finished my doctorate, I kind of went into my doctorate saying I don't know what I want to do in academia. I like teaching. I've never done research, so I don't know if I like that. And I came out kind of saying research is fine, it's cool, but that I'm good at teaching. That's what I'm good at. It's what I like. What gets me out of bed in the morning, and that's what I want to do. And, if I took a position someplace like Ohio State, my professors there never saw undergrads. Undergrads were taught almost completely by TAs, and most of my TAs were phenomenal. So, nothing against them at all, but, as a faculty member, that's not what I want to do. So I was applying across the whole country to small teaching-oriented colleges. And it just so happened that Chadron was a really good fit for what I wanted and what my family wanted. I have my son moved with us and my husband works online, thank goodness, so he can work from home. And we wanted my son to grow up in a place where he knew people and it wasn't just a number in a massive school district. And and so that just kind of fit really well and it all worked out.
Yeah, we have some friends who live in Minneapolis, and they talk about they wanted to move, but they didn't want to move to where it was because the school district where they currently live is really great. And I never even have thought about things like that from living in small town
such a big
Nebraska.
factor.
It really is.
It is, yeah.
All right. Well, Elizabeth, let's talk a little bit about your research. So you mentioned it focuses on dialogue in classrooms, especially the relationships that develop in the classroom and having difficult conversations. So, what's all that about?
So I got into my PhD program because I taught 8th grade for a year, and then I taught adult ed, which was mostly GED prep classes for 2.5 years after that. And I really felt like I was at a loss because I had been through, at that point, 2 education programs. And I felt like I was doing all the things that they told me to do. They're like, do this in your classroom. This is good teaching, whatever. And it wasn't working. And I didn't know what to do. And I would try to go online and I try to read about things. And, I couldn't find. And I was like, where is this information? Why is this information not available to me? And so I was like, I'm going to get a PhD and I'm going to make sure this information is available to people. And now I know that all that research exists. It just wasn't something that I was taught how to find or how to read effectively. And so I really wanted to get into research that had a very real, very practical, applicable meaning for teachers and students in classrooms. A lot of research, and nothing against it, but a lot of research is done in labs. It's done survey-based. That's not something that's interesting to me. I want to be in the classroom studying what is happening, what people are saying, how it's functioning, so that way we can help teachers do it better. Because I just feel like education is one of those things that can be so phenomenal when it works. And when it doesn't work, it gives kids anxiety and it hurts their mental health and it hurts their capability feelings and all of those things. And so, I was really, really fortunate to get in a lab with Dr. Sujung Lin at Ohio State, and she is doing a lot of different projects. But one of them was based on literature-based free-flowing conversations in 5th grade classrooms. And we literally went into the classrooms, we trained the teachers, and then we sat and we watched while these kids had these really in-depth conversations about things where they'd read a story about something like bullying. And then they'd sit down and they'd talk about it. And you'd see kids who were failing every single subject in class come out and say things that were really thoughtful and profound. And the teachers were reflecting in interviews with us like, I didn't know that kid had that in them. I've never seen that side of them before. And so there were several kids in our project that went from failing their English class to getting an A in their English class over the 6 weeks that we were in their classroom.
Oh, that's great.
And so we really got to see the transformative power of those conversations. Yeah. And one of the schools that we were working in was an inner city school with a largely immigrant population. They had kids in this one 5th grade classroom from 19 different countries.
Wow.
And so to hear these kids, one of the stories that we had them read was about a family in the 1960s who traveled south in a gold Cadillac and how they were accused of stealing this car by the police and things like that. And to hear them sit down and talk about things that happen on the bus that align with the types of things that happened in this story in the 1960s was just absolutely astounding. And then you interview their classmates, and their classmates are like, I had no idea these things were happening in my school. And so these are, 10 and 11-year-olds. Mm-hmm. These are not mostly grown kids that they're little. But they are experiencing these things and thinking about these things. And when you give them permission to talk about these experiences in school, it has a massive impact on their well-being, their happiness, and their performance. And so that's really where my research has come from. And so, we saw in looking at that data set, we saw that some of the teachers, some groups of students had these really profound, deep conversations, and others didn't. And so I asked the question, well, why? Why is it that even with the same teacher, some groups of 5 kids are blossoming and some groups are just arguing with each other, right? And what my dissertation is on the equity that's present within those groups. So if we think about equity, we have 2 main types. One is participatory, which is, can I speak and be heard, right? Am I not getting interrupted? That kind of stuff. And the other is relational. Are people considering my ideas of value equitably within the group? And so I took 72 discussion transcripts, thousands of lines of speech, and I coded it for evidence that kids were considering other people's thoughts and when they were interrupting each other, to see if we could quantify equity in a way that let us analyze how the teachers, and then also how the teachers were engaging with those students to either support or inhibit equity, to see if then we could maybe train them to be more supportive of equity in those discussions, so that our struggling students, for instance, can have more of a say, so that they can become more participatory and have their ideas taken seriously. And so, that's something that's not really been done before. So a lot of the research on equity so far has either been focused on things like gender and racial equity rather than interpersonal equity, or it's been really, really in-depth descriptive stuff, but it hasn't really gone to the dialogue level and said, can we look at a conversation and see what's happening to reflect equity, and see if it is present or not, or to what extent it's present, and how teachers are interacting with that equity and responding to it. And so that's kind of where my research has evolved from. And then this most recent paper that you mentioned is actually not a research article. It's in a publication specifically for teachers and other practitioners in schools, that it's called Theory into Practice. So it's essentially taking education research and then translating it into a way that's more applicable, shorter, less academic sounding, easier to understand for people who are literally doing it in the classroom. And so myself and some of my colleagues were like, hey, we could put this together and really translate some of these findings for teachers who are actually engaging in these conversations with these kids.
Yeah, great to be able to apply it.
Yeah,
it definitely is.
That's the dream, is to be able to make all this academic mumbo jumbo that we talk about actually matter.
Yeah. So I don't know if I will have the terms right, but was your study primarily qualitative, or was it like a mixed method?
It was mostly quantitative with a little bit of qualitative research. So I did a qualitative case study that I published a few years ago. And it sort of set the stage. It was extremely in-depth, looking at only 2 groups of students, comparing them. And then based on those findings, I was able to generalize to the entire data set of students and to do a quantitative study for my dissertation.
Okay. So I could kind of tell when Daniel asked this, you kind of got a little pep in your step when you're talking about research. Where did that interest begin? I mean, it clearly is you as an educator, it's a passion for you. Where did that start?
So, I can remember being in the second grade and getting excited when people would ask me to explain something. And, like, even that far back, like, I liked to teach people stuff. But I never really, my mom was a teacher. And so I knew how hard it was. And she was always kind of like, don't be a teacher. It's really, really hard. It's really hard. And I ignored her, and she was mad at me for a minute. But it worked out okay. So, and so I never really considered that for a career path. But then, I'd had all these different majors and nothing really seemed to fit. And I liked the content, but then I'd do an internship and I was like, this job just isn't what I like, until I got in a classroom. And I was like, this is me. This is what I like to do. This is what I'm good at. And I said, quit fighting it and just get the education degree. And the research, I think, stems from that because I see so many teachers struggling and they really want to do what's right for these kids, but they don't know how.
Yeah.
And so for me, the research is just the next logical step of, like, I've been fortunate and privileged enough to get the education that, like, I am by far not a perfect teacher, but I have the expertise and the knowledge to help people understand the psychology behind learning. And then when you understand how and why people learn, it becomes easier to support them in that learning. And so that's really, especially in an era in which, people are being limited in what they can talk about in classrooms and what they can have their students read and things like that, I try to really advocate for, like, trust the kids with their own minds. They have the capacity. They're thinking about these and they're experiencing these things anyway. And when we can bring that into schools, we can not only support them in becoming more empathetic, but we can also support them in developing their own identity and their own critical thinking skills in ways that just don't happen when all we do is hammer content into them and get them to memorize it. Mm-hmm. We have the opportunity to support them in becoming the best versions of themselves that they can be, by asking them questions like, where have you seen racism? And even in my college classes, I've had some students who have come out and said, oh, yeah, this happened to me at Walmart. This happened to me wherever, here in town. And some of my other students are like, wait, what? They're absolutely blown away that those issues still exist, because if you don't deal with it every day, you don't see it. Mm-hmm. And giving them the forum to build that understanding and that knowledge, I think, is really important. And it's something that I have seen have a really big impact in students' lives.
Elizabeth, has the pandemic had any effect on classroom interactions? I think, from my experience with all these Zoom meetings that I've had to sit through, that's got to be. But has that factored into any of your research as it's continuing?
Well, so I actually planned a completely different dissertation. And then the pandemic happened, and I actually had planned to go into schools and collect data based on my own sort of taking the discussion data and then making a few changes to it, and then training new teachers and seeing if we could support teachers and students in building healthier relationships in the classroom, because we know that it's really, really difficult once a kid has a bad relationship with a teacher. A lot of times it's a kindergarten teacher. That tends to follow them all the way through high school, which leads to lower grades, lower well-being, higher risk of dropping out, right? All this stuff. So if we can get teachers to fix that and have a positive relationship with these struggling students, we can have a really big impact on their academic trajectory. So that's what I initially set out to do, and then all the schools shut down.
Yeah.
So I ended up having to use some data that we had already collected, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. So, like, I'm not mad about that, but it had that impact on my research. I know a lot of people are starting to study the differences between online learning for the social environment and things like that. I have not been part of that so much, but I know it's happening. But I mean, even in my own son, just seeing the difference in, like, what school seems like for him, having been at home for a year, then that reintegration back into school has been really challenging, especially for the really little kiddos, because they never had a normal school. If they miss kindergarten, then suddenly they're expected to be first graders, and they don't know how.
Yeah, that's got to be a factor. What grade is he in then?
He's in 4th.
Okay, so at least he hadn't had that start.
Thankfully, yeah. So he got to finish first grade. And then he was out his second grade year. Okay.
And I guess I've heard that myself, too, that some of the younger kids, I think, Alex, you mentioned that to me, that the younger kids that didn't have that same kind of socialization that you'd expect to. Mm-hmm. That's a tough one.
Elizabeth, was your research, was it focused on public school students or was it a mix between public and private?
We were working entirely in public schools.
Okay. So very applicable to our listening audience. I'm sure
Yes.
most of us probably went
Yeah.
to public schools.
Yeah. And they were teachers from around Columbus. So as you can imagine with Ohio State right there, Columbus City Schools gets pretty inundated
Oh, yeah. I
with
would
research
think.
requests, right? Everybody wants to come study their kids. And so they're pretty selective about who they let in their school. But we were working with several different schools around kind of the center of the city. And so because of that, we were able to have very, very different populations of students at different schools, which from a research perspective and trying to consider latent variables and everything like that is not great, right? But from an applied perspective was phenomenal because we're like, this is working for kids from immigrant families in one of the poorest suburbs of the city, and it's working in this, mostly Black and Caucasian middle income suburb. And so a lot of times you don't see that kind of generalizability. But because if you think about the nature of a conversation, it's very adaptable to the interests and the ideas of who's in the room. And so because of that, we could read the same story and have totally different discussions. And that's what we saw happening, was that the discussions in one group of students went in a totally different direction than the discussion about the same story in a different group of students, which was really neat. And so I think this idea, not necessarily the specific intervention that we were working with, but this idea that kids need to have conversations in class, not just be talked at. Right? They need to have someone listen to their ideas. They need to practice putting their ideas into words. They need to have their peers challenge them and be like, that doesn't seem right. Like, that doesn't make sense, and have to revise their own thinking. Those are important thinking skills. But then if we can get them thinking about things like bullying, why do people bully? Right? Well, maybe it's because they're really insecure themselves, and they can start to build that empathy and understand how these social interactions come about. Then not only can we benefit them as thinkers and as learners, but we can also benefit the social interaction in the classroom. And we know that when there's a positive social culture in a classroom, kids learn more, they're happier, they have higher well-being, higher achievement, right? All that stuff.
Yeah, much more inclusive environment. Now, kind of to switch gears a little bit, but I've heard from a reputable source that you enjoy baking and gardening. Talk a little bit about that.
So I didn't know that I liked gardening. I've always liked baking, but I didn't know I liked gardening until
You majored in it.
Then it was one of my 47 majors. No, I decided I wanted to grow a tomato because, growing up, my grandma had a huge garden, and we would always get tomatoes from her garden. And a tomato from a garden tasted nothing like a tomato from the grocery store. And I was like, and then, my grandparents had to move in out of the farm, so we didn't have grandma's tomatoes anymore. I was like, I'm going to grow some tomatoes. And then I was kind of like, this is really, therapeutic. I like this. And now my house is covered in plants. My office is covered in plants. My son, grabs my arm and drags me past the plant section in Walmart. He's like, Mom, you don't need any more plants. So, and I've built some raised beds. I mostly like to grow things I can eat is the preference. My garden did really badly this year. Trying to figure out the shift in climate coming from, this is my first Nebraska garden. It didn't do so hot. But
The summers here are dry and hot.
Yeah.
really dry and hot. I was unprepared. So I think hopefully next year I'll do a little better. But yeah, I've got chickens now too. So it was always the
fun.
joke in grad school. I was telling my husband for years, I want chickens so we can have fresh eggs. And he's like, when you finish your PhD, I will get you chickens.
There we go.
And so all my friends in PhD school knew that. And so when I graduated, they were like, you're going to get your chickens now, right? And they we're teasing my husband, you better go buy some chickens. So we have chickens. They started laying a couple months ago. So I got my PhD chickens. It took us a while to build a coop and get all that stuff set up, So hopefully next year I'll have some fresh vegetables. Last year we got that email saying that they had the wild plums, that the wild plum trees were overproducing, and they were afraid the deer were gonna damage the trees.
Yeah.
And so I went and I picked a bunch. I was like, I've never even heard of a wild plum, but let's see what this is about. And then I made a bunch of jam, and it was so good. And then I kept watching the trees, and I was like, nobody everybody else was picking it. So I think I picked like 30 pounds of wild plums last year and turned it all into jam.
Good.
And we had enough jam to last from in the like early fall until like February. So like that's the dream, is that I'll be able to can enough tomatoes and like pickles and all jam and everything. I planted a bunch of my own wild plum trees at home and some Sandhills cherries and
Awesome.
all that stuff. So hopefully here in a few years. And then baking, I've liked to bake since I was little. I can remember my mom would make our birthday cakes, and then, you know, when I was too little to really bake, she would just give me icing and food coloring and let me go to town. And I would have these ridiculously elaborate cakes with, you know, 3 inches of sprinkles on them, and like,
Those
I'm
are
sure
the
they
good
did.
ones.
Yeah, that's the way to go.
Right? It was intense. And then as I got, you know, to be like 9, 10, 11, I started baking it and then decorating it myself. And then my poor mother tried to do the same thing with my brother, thinking, you know, this is a great learning activity. And my brother's like, ugh, can I be done? But then actually in undergrad, I had to stop eating gluten. And so now my baking consists of trying to make things taste as good without gluten as they do with gluten. And really, I'm also a vegetarian. So taking kind of childhood favorite recipes and adapting them to make them gluten-free and vegetarian and not taste terrible. And so that's what I do. And I figure I've done it well when the carnivores in my family, you know, my dad and my brother, can eat it and not complain about the fact that it's tofu. And I've got a few things that they will eat and not even notice the tofu. Because my dad's always like, ugh, tofu, you know? And I'm like, but did you know that you were eating tofu? I don't think you did.
I had a lasagna tofu one time that was really good.
Yeah,
So, I mean, it can be done.
it can. I make chili dogs with tofu chili. And I make a chicken pot pie with tofu instead of chicken, and then gluten-free biscuits on the top. It's really, really good. And then I make, my husband grew up in East Tennessee, so I make biscuits and gravy for him with tofu, and I just season it like you would season sausage, and it's really good. You'd never know unless you were told.
That's awesome.
Yeah. All right. So, final main question for you, Elizabeth, is what are some of your other interests away from work when you're not tending the garden?
Yeah, when I'm not tending the garden, I love to read. My friends got me into the Libby app because I was like, you know, I don't have time to go to the library and check out books, and then I can't read it in time to get it back. And they were like, you need this app. And I was like, but I don't want to read it on a Kindle. But they convinced me to try it, and it is life-changing. So if anybody doesn't have it, you link your library card to this app, and then it gives you access to all of the ebooks and audiobooks that your library has access to, which is often a very much bigger repertoire of books than they physically have on the shelf. And so I have been reading on my iPad because I can just get the books there and read it like you would on a Kindle.
Yeah.
And that has been very exciting. So I've been doing a lot of that. We go to do as much hiking as we can. So, you know, I wanted to be a paleontologist pre-vet major and wildlife science major and all that. I was supposed to be a paleontologist. And so I'm kind of a geology nerd a little bit. So I like to go look at rocks and fossils. So this summer we actually went to Iceland.
Oh, beautiful.
Because I've wanted to go there since I was a kid, and I found out about the volcanoes and how many different things exist only in Iceland. You know, that like it's a very unique geological place. So we went and did that. And so I like to hike, and we go up to Badlands and several different parks in South Dakota and hike around. And I have 3 dogs, so some of them we can take them and some of them we can't. And my brother lives near Seattle. And so I've been able to go visit him and hike around, and so
that's great.
That if it's outside, I pretty much like to do it: hiking, camping, canoeing, or kayaking more than canoeing, anything like that. I grew up around horses too, so that's a big hobby of mine. I'm hoping
the fresh air and everything else.
Yeah, here in a little. My son's really into it too, so we have horse fences ready to go. We just don't have the horses yet.
Well, you're ready for them.
Yeah.
So we've reached that portion of our interview where we just have kind of some quick questions. So the first thing that comes to the top of your mind.
Okay.
What's a favorite movie of yours?
You know, I really love the old classic 1950s and 60s musicals, the golden age of musicals, The Sound of Music and all that stuff. I grew up watching the Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers musicals with my mom. Nobody in my house wants to watch them with me now, which is really sad. It makes me miss my mom because we used to watch all those, and they have the flowy dresses, and they wear those totally impractical high heels, and they do the soft shoe.
Yep.
Oh, I love just about any of those.
Nice.
Would probably fit the bill.
What is a hidden talent of yours?
Ooh, I was thinking about this because I was watching some of your other interviews, and so I was like, I need to have an answer prepared. I can do the Cups song from, I can't even think of the movie now. Anna Kendrick was in it. And they had an a cappella group.
Oh, Pitch Perfect.
Pitch Perfect, yeah.
Yeah.
So I've been doing the Cups song for probably about 10 years before that movie came out. And I didn't know there were words to it. But when I was in like middle school, it was a game, and you had to try to do the rhythm on the cups, and you had to pass the cup around the table, and if you dropped it or messed up the beat, you were out.
Oh, right. This is the one with like multiple cups and you bang them around and like little drums.
This one
right?
just has one, yeah, but
Okay.
it's a tapping, like spinning, and you have to spin the cup and make all the different rhythm noises.
Shoot,
And
wish we had one in here.
yeah, I would do that for you.
Need a demonstration.
My my eighth graders thought that was the coolest thing because that was like right after that movie came out.
Oh, yeah.
And so that was like my bribe was like, if you guys get all your work done today, I will do the cup song at the end of class, and it worked. They were very into it.
That's awesome.
So this would be good for you since you said you're an avid reader. If you could have a conversation with any fictional character, who would it be? I suppose it doesn't have to be in a book, but
That's so hard.
Yeah, so a lot of good fictional
There's
characters.
so many. My favorite book for so many years, and I call it a book, it's actually a series of books, but I came across it as a single volume where all the books were bound together. It's called The Enchanted Forest Chronicles, and it's by Patricia C. Reed. And I think I would want to hang out with one of the characters in there. It's, there's dragons and there's witches, and there's an enchanted forest, obviously, because it's called The Enchanted Forest Chronicles. And it's one of those books that there's nothing in it that makes you, like, scared or stressed or worried, but it has enough action that it's so engaging. And it's one that if I just am having a really bad day and I need something really comforting, I go back to that.
Yeah.
And so I think I would want to just about anybody in those books, I would be happy to have a conversation with.
just hang out.
Just hang out. I feel like we would get along really well. I've also always wanted to meet Anne Shirley from Anne of Green Gables,
Okay.
because as a kid, I came across those books and I just felt like we were like connected. Like I felt like we got each other. And so I feel like we would be really good friends if I could meet Anne Shirley. That would be really exciting.
Yeah. What is your favorite thing to do in the fall?
All of the things.
That's a lot of good things.
I like to pick apples. I like to pick pumpkins. I like to carve the pumpkins. I like to make soup. I made potato soup the other day, and it was really, really good. I like to just like walk around and look at the leaves. There's not so many of those here. There's not very many
Yeah,
trees.
not-
some of the riverbeds and that.
Yeah, find some trees. No, fall is my favorite time of year. It might have something to do with the fact that my birthday's in the fall. As a child, that might have biased me.
Sure.
But, that just the air is getting colder. You're finally not sweating. You get to bring out your sweaters and your boots. I might have been singing a song about getting to bring out my boots in one of my classes.
Yeah, you got to wear your comfy clothes.
Get to wear,
it is the season.
And
It
get my
is.
blanket, and my cat curls up with me, and I can have some hot tea. Like, I love fall. I love
Yeah.
everything about fall.
It's the best.
It is.
Yeah.
Last one for you. What is the word that comes to your mind when you think of Chadron State College?
I think I would say opportunity. Because given kind of where we're located, the school provides so many opportunities that don't exist in this region otherwise. It's not just a matter of go 5 miles down the road and pick another college like it is in some parts of the country. And so, especially given the amount of first-generation students we have, that there's just a lot of opportunities for students here that they wouldn't get were it not for the school. And from my own perspective, I get to teach so many more classes and a diversity of classes that I probably wouldn't get to teach in a lot of other places, which can be kind of exhausting. But it's also really exciting because I get to engage with students in a lot of different ways on a lot of different levels and kind of think about my field from so many different angles in a way that's really exciting.
Wonderful. Great answer.
Yep. Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. We appreciate having you here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.